Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed, monthly Q&A, and I didn't have to drive to Tim's house. Pretty special. So Tim's come to me this time.
Must be love and life.
I mean, I love driving to Tim's house once a month, but yeah, new studio. I've got the room to accommodate Tim, and we're here for the November.
That's right, November 2021. Getting the year correct.
Yep. So Q&A, we asked you guys to give us your questions on the community tab. Many of you have done that. So we're going to jump in and answer a whole heap of them in this part one. But before we do, today's video sponsor is Thermal Grizzly and their Cryonaut Extreme, which is now available in a 2-gram syringe. This high-performance thermal paste delivers maximum thermal conductivity thanks to an extremely small particle size and layer thickness. It's also very flexible, capable of standing up to sub-zero temperatures for extreme overclocking, but also performs exceptionally well for air and water cooling applications. So if your CPU or GPU needs repasting, then I suggest checking out the Thermal Grizzly range. Link is in the video description. Would you consider doing an update to game compatibility with Alder Lake after a month or two? Might be interesting to see how it advances. Yeah, that's absolutely something I'll be looking at, because obviously the situation right now is a bit annoying. We talked about it in the last month's Q&A. I'm expecting that it's something that will be addressed, this month, next month at the latest. But we'll have to see. But yeah, that's a month or two after release. So we'll definitely be looking into that. And if it's still a problem, then that is going to be a big problem for 12th gen, because you obviously, if you're going to buy a gaming CPU, you want all your games to be able to work, at least without having to go into the BIOS and disable E-cores or stuff like that, which I guess is an easy enough workaround and won't really hurt performance. If anything, the evidence suggests that it improves performance, but it's still a bit janky.
Yep.
All right, next one here, Tim. This touches on the M1 by the looks of it.
Ooh, exciting.
Yes, well, we'll see. Do you think eventually the component spec arms race will shift away from power to efficiency? Card and CPU power consumption seems like it's getting out of control or out of hand. And I feel like we're well into the point of diminishing returns in terms of fidelity, and motion performance now at 4K 120 is almost viable. Is the M1 perhaps where AMD, Intel, and NVIDIA should be looking towards in the consumer market more than pushing raw compute?
No.
I thought that was a no, yeah?
Yeah, I guess there's a few things to break down here. One of the things I wanted to touch on first is this talk of, feels like we're well into the point of diminishing returns in terms of fidelity and motion performance. That may be true with today's games, but there's still a lot that can be done in games and various things that can cripple the performance that we've got today. Like if a game wanted to really push ray tracing effects to the point where the game is fully ray traced, that's not even like feasible on today's GPU hardware. They just aren't powerful enough. So I get what you're kind of saying, as in like they're kind of going crazy on power and not really focusing on efficiency to get big gains that aren't required in today's games. But I think a lot of these GPUs are also designed so that game developers can do things in the future.
I mean, that's not necessarily true either. So I think, and this has been really evident with the Core i9 1200K, people tend to look at the power consumption and the performance of Halo products. I guess that's what makes them a Halo product. And they make assumptions based on that for what the lower end parts do, despite the fact that we know like the 6700 XT, for example, is ridiculously power efficient compared to the higher end parts.
Yep.
It's not like they're just, staying at the same efficiency level, but, only extracting more performance by increasing power usage.
Yeah, they're outpacing the power consumption increases that they've gone with. And the only reason they're doing that is because they realize that, we can actually put bigger coolers and cope with the higher power requirements. Like that's what the desktop platform's all about. It's kind of the unleashed requirements and the higher power limits.
So it looks bad when they're pushing well out of that efficiency window with those Halo products. And again, we see that with the 1200K, which I thought maybe a bit of a mistake on Intel's behalf, because there's this stigma around 12th gen now that it's just stupidly power hungry. It's virtually impossible to keep the CPUs cool and avoid throttling. And while that's fairly true for the 1200K, it's really not at all true for the 12700K, and certainly not at all for the 12600K, which are no more difficult or don't consume any more power in really any workload than the equivalent AMD products. So yeah, people really tend to hone in on those Halo products. And
I think Apple has really played into that with the M1, where their marketing is, really going after these power inefficient parts that Intel and NVIDIA and AMD are coming up with. But then again, it's kind of like comparing one thing that's designed for efficiency to parts that aren't as designed for efficiency. So I think when you bring the M1 to this discussion, when you're talking about should they go down that route, it's like, well, the M1 isn't exactly the fastest thing going around. Like, it's good in the mobile space, but the M1 is, you put that into a desktop and it would be easily beaten by Halo products of today, like a 12900K or an RTX 3090 or whatever. So I think they need to put some more focus into it for the mobile side, where efficiency really does matter because you're constrained by all sorts of things, the size of the coolers, the power, the battery life, and that's where Apple's done a really good job. But yeah, on the desktop side, I don't think it's that much of a concern. And certainly Apple on the counter side would actually need to increase their power consumption to get to the performance levels that we've already got. So I guess it kind of goes both ways, and you need to be optimizing for different things depending on the platforms that you've got access to.
All right. What do you think will be the first games of the next generation consoles? The next generation
I assume he
consoles.
means this current, like the PS5, Xbox Series X, right?
Yeah, they're like this generation.
They're now the current gen.
Yeah. I believe that's what he means. To really push modern PC hardware to its limits, both graphically and on the CPU front. Fully maximizing high core count CPUs, i.e. 5900X and 5950X. I've got a bit to say about that, but I'll let you answer it first. Tying into this huge AI breakthroughs in games to be too much for current Zen 2 8-core CPUs in the Series X/PS5. Did you get all that?
Yes,
okay.
I think so.
Right.
So I'm skeptical of whether the games that are made for the Series X and PS5 will ever utilize the 5900X and 5950X fully this generation.
Well, they can't, right?
Because I don't think there's the incentive to multi-thread it into that range of core count. These new consoles have 8 cores, so I guess you could put the effort into. I mean, some games are automatically going to be multi-threaded to the level where they will spread the load out over 16 cores. Others are going to focus on more like a Battlefield 2042, where it's kind of like an 8-ish core.
Not to interrupt your train of thought, but to what end?
Yeah.
What is the benefit? You can have an Ashes of the Benchmark type game that'll spread over 16 cores or threads or whatever. What's the benefit? So people seem to think that if Battlefield 2042, it'll heavily utilize 8 cores of a Zen 3 type architecture or slower. If you have 8 cores that are twice the performance of Zen 3, then it will only probably utilize half of those. It doesn't use more of the CPU because there's more of the CPU. It has a set workload, and however the CPU squeezes that in across the amount of cores that it will allow it to, that's sort of what you get. So my point is, if they had have made Battlefield 2042 work across 16 cores rather than 8, the performance on the 5950X would be 0% different.
Yeah.
It would still be using the same overall percentage of the CPU. It would just be spreading the workload evenly across that CPU, which would do nothing for it, and it would certainly do nothing for 8-core or 6-core CPUs. So there's people who are saying it's unoptimized because it doesn't utilize 12 and 16-core CPUs. They're just wrong. If they spread the load across 16 cores and then utilize the CPU in a way that would improve performance, like the CPU was doing more things in the game, let's just say, then maybe you would get better performance on the 5950X, but it would absolutely cripple every other CPU to the point where it just couldn't play the game.
Yeah, because there's a fixed amount of processing.
So sorry to go off on that little tangent, but the whole core thing with gaming just...
it's irritating, isn't it? It's irritating. So I think, the main question is, how will it be too much for the Zen 2 8-core CPU? So that the performance level of that CPU, which I guess is probably 2700X, 3700X-ish, probably slightly slower.
Yep.
Because it's clocked lower.
The console CPU.
The consoles,
Yep.
So, if we're talking about when will it really push the modern CPU PC hardware to its limits, well, we've seen that with a Battlefield type title. That is, the 128-player multiplayer modes are limited to the new consoles and PC. They don't run on the older consoles. That is where we're starting to see those limits. And the only way they could really scale it to use more of the CPU cores is to make almost like placebo quality settings where like the draw distance is so ludicrously far, which can maybe increase your CPU load at times, that then you would start to see the load increase on those 5900X type products. But because those CPUs are more powerful than what's in the consoles, the optimization point is always going to be below the level of those 12 and 16 core parts, because they're going to need to make it run on the Series X CPU. So I don't think we'll see with this generation game developers push much beyond that, which is what we've seen in previous generations and why CPU performance was never much of a concern with last generation titles, because the Jaguar CPU in like the PS4 was so bad that PC CPUs were destroying it routinely, so you never need to upgrade your CPU because no developer would go, okay, well, we're going to make it run like absolute trash on a console, so then you need it to run really well on
basically
high core count CPUs.
On the more demanding games, we're going to see a situation where 4-core CPUs, even with hyper-threading, are starting, they're being shown the door.
Yep.
But this whole, the 5600X isn't going to be able to game into the future. I can't see it. Like, if you can't play a game without avoiding stuttering on something like a Ryzen 5 5600X, most gamers won't be able to play that game.
Yeah.
So there's no incentive for a game developer to do that. And again, if they had utilized the 12 and 16 core CPU, you can't utilize, I guess the other thing to talk about is the fact that CPU related performance aspects of a game aren't scalable.
Not to anywhere near the extent.
Like they are scalable in the sense that you could have 64 players, not 128, but that's for everybody.
Exactly.
So you can't enter a 128 player game and go, well, I don't really have enough processing power for that. I'm going to scale it back to 64. It's like, well, you're in a different server then. And you can't disable destruction, for example. I mean, again, you could disable it, but you'd be doing that for everybody within that server. It'd be so weird walking past a wall that appears to be there, but it's actually blown out and there's people shooting you through it. And that they can see you, but you can't see them. So basically, the stuff that hogs the CPU processing power, it's not like your GPU where you can be in the same server as someone and you can be like, well, the vegetation is smashing my frame rate. I'm just going to lower vegetation.
Or something as simple as resolution. There's no resolution for CPU.
That's right.
That's pretty much what we're going to see. And again, you could do a little bit more CPU scaling in single-player games, something like a Hitman where you can scale from like thousands of NPCs to hundreds of NPCs. Yeah, it makes the game look worse, but it's a single-player title. But most of the really CPU-demanding games are typically your multiplayer titles because
of
the
breaks the game doing that.
Yeah, the single-player titles tend to hit the GPU more. So there's all sorts of considerations. And what we're talking about when we say that it's hard to utilize these CPUs is not because, it'd be nice to have a CPU utilize 16 cores 100% so you can get high frame rates. It's about the fixed processing portion of the title where every 60 seconds you have to update the location of 128 players on the map. That uses a certain amount of processing power and it cannot be completed faster. It has to be done at its set interval. So it sets the sort of processing power that you need on the CPU. So I guess it's a long answer for this, in that there will be more CPU intensive games and games that will be more like the Battlefield title that we see, but there's going to be that limit of the lowest common denominator, which will be around the 3700X-ish level so that it runs on the consoles. Mm-hmm. How much automation do you use when benchmarking? Any plans to automate more, or is it not worth the time, for example, given limitations with some games? So the only part of my testing that I automate is the monitor response time testing. That's really the only thing where it's like one click does the whole chart, because it would take me like a day per chart to do manually. So I don't do that. But I think, you don't automate much of your testing either because it's just too much of a hassle.
Well, first of all, it's impossible to automate proper game benchmarks. It can't be done for at least the vast majority of games because they're dynamic in nature.
They don't have canned benchmarks. And canned benchmark is not great in some games as well.
Yeah, canned benchmarks can be okay for certain things. Sometimes more GPU testing, less. They're not. It's not often they're good for CPU benchmarking, but not always true. But yes, I don't automate because it doesn't make sense for what I do, and it actually doesn't work. So I could automate the productivity benchmarks, and a lot of them are automated to a degree anyway for me, like the Puget benchmark and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
But automating the whole suite. Plus, I like to. Well, I suppose there's ways around. Anyway, I don't do it.
Yep, fair enough.
Okay, one here from Sam. Your Battlefield 2042 video almost sounded like you defended DICE, and you gave the impression we were throwing around optimization for no reason. Not sure I was sort of hinting that it was no reason. It's just that it's the generic term. Like,
it's used for a lot of games.
Every game is unoptimized, which maybe arguably a lot of them are, but anyway. The game only utilizes 8 threads while other threads are sitting idle. Okay, how is that not the dev's fault? Okay, we've sort of talked about this, but there's not much destruction in 2042. I mean, subjective argument, I guess. Maps and open fields. So it's either the 128 players, it's kind of a big deal, or the weather effects. Warzone or Call of Duty Modern Warfare Ground War Mode has 0 problems with 150 players. Not sure it's 0 problems. I'm pretty sure a lot of Warzone players have performance-related problems. And it has plenty of vehicles too. So I doubt it's the weather choking the CPUs that much. Yeah, it's probably the 128 players. Please clear your stance.
We're making a stance, are we? We're putting into the ground, we're defending DICE.
First of all, I'd chill out a bit because my comments were just trying to help explain the situation. And there's probably a bit more to it than just being outraged about. Yeah. First of all, I've done my fair share of bashing EA. I prefer not to go after the developers themselves because I feel like it's the publishers that are probably to blame more than the developers. I'm sure the developers would like to sit around and create a well-polished game. I think they're probably the people that are more passionate about the product and want to deliver something that, I think they get enjoyment out of the players enjoying it.
Yep.
So I prefer not to bash them, but that's neither here nor there. So first of all, I don't know a single soul from DICE. I've never spoken to anyone who works at DICE. I don't have a contact at DICE. The same is also true for EA.
And for most game developers.
Because we focus on computer hardware and we don't review games. So, yeah.
Yep. But I think when it comes to this optimization thing...
Yeah, let's start with that.
Let's talk about that because optimization is used too often. Or this game is poorly optimized. And usually the examples that you see are people comparing, let's say, big open world game. We don't even have to name names. Just they compare big open world game to small linear corridor shooter. So this
guy's not doing that, but go on.
But this is where we normally see people throwing around optimization as kind of I played big open world game and frame rate was lower than narrow limited corridor shooter, therefore big open world game is poorly optimized. And that's not necessarily true because the games are different. And that's where we need to separate with these talks of optimization. Is the game poorly optimized or is it just different to the games that you were playing before? And this is going to be a constant talk because games improve. They add more features, they do more things. So you would expect that games that do more things are going to run on the same hardware worse than games that came before. So one angle that you could take for Battlefield 2042 is you compare this Battlefield directly to the previous one. They're very similar games, except in one major aspect, and that is the increase from 64 to 128 players.
Massive.
So Battlefield 5 runs pretty well. I think
it
most
hammers
people would
quad cores with 8 threads. It's playable, but it hammers them.
I think most people would say on reasonable hardware that it runs pretty well. You can get decent frame rates. So one angle that you could take for saying that it's not poorly optimized is they doubled the player count, which should significantly increase the load. But of course, one of the angles that's brought up in this question is the fact that Warzone, generally in my experience, does run at a higher frame rate. Whether it runs better is subjective, but runs at a higher frame rate with 150 players.
Though.
But that's right, it is a completely different game. It is, in my opinion, looks worse graphically. It's kind of a...
That's a GPU load thing.
It is a GPU load thing,
for
but
the most part.
It's kind of more of a... The best way I could describe it is Call of Duty appears designed for last-gen consoles, whereas Battlefield appears designed for current-gen consoles.
If you got a closing circle late game Call of Duty, I'm pulling on my Fortnite knowledge for this, But if you had a game mode, like a late game mode, so Fortnite added a late game mode. If you had a
Yep.
late game Warzone mode, now I'm not super familiar with Warzone. I have played it a bit, but I'm not,
You're not
super
an
familiar-
expert.
Not an expert in it.
Yep.
But if they made a late game mode where all the players were jumping into like one town type area,
Yep.
the game, I guarantee you, would run significantly worse than
Yep.
what you see now, because all the action is around you. It's in a closed area. It's all happening. But again, those games, you play Battlefield from start to finish, and it's just horrible if the hardware is struggling. Call of Duty will get progressively better because the more action there is, the more people are dying and getting sent back to the lobby, and then you end up with less people in the server. So it doesn't have 150 people in the server for very long. Usually there's hot drops, players get culled very quickly.
50 of those players die in probably the first couple of minutes.
In public lobbies, half the lobby will get wiped out within minutes, probably. Yeah, I mean, that happens in Fortnite. And then, as I said, Fortnite, if you jump into that game and you go even to a hot drop, the demand isn't that severe. But then if you get a professional, like, scrim type match, it's insane at the end of the game. You still have more than half the lobby up in a small area. The stuttering's horrific. And they introduced an arena late game mode, and the demands on your PC are just through the roof compared to general public matches. That's because, again, all the players, like in Battlefield, there's less than 100 players really. You start with 100, but again, as soon as you hit the ground, a couple of people get knocked off straight away. And it's as bad as the Battlefield experience, but people are willing to put up with it because within minutes it gets progressively better as the lobby dies out.
Yeah, that's right. So
Again,
I don't want to sit here and say the game is well optimized because again, it's like
I'm sure
I don't
it can be
know.
improved. I'm
I'm sure it could be improved.
but we have to acknowledge the fact that they've doubled the player count.
yeah,
There are more. I don't really want to argue with how much destruction there is because it's like there is destruction.
yeah. It always reminds me of people like looking at a game like Cyberpunk, just as one example, and saying, "Oh, this game is poorly optimized," and it's like, yeah, but have you played the game on medium settings? And this is a different thing. This is a GPU optimization versus CPU optimization.
And we realized that game was an SHIT show to begin with.
It was,
but it's still very demanding now.
There are lots of. Not denying there's lots of issues with Cyberpunk, but there's a difference between complaining about ultra settings in that game being poorly optimized and medium settings, because medium looks like very, very similar and can like almost double your frame rate. So these are all the discussions that come around with optimization, and why personally I think the term is thrown up too much as kind of a catch-all, like, is your hardware just not good enough, or is it poorly optimized?
Well, again, if you play 64-player Battlefield, it's much less demanding.
Yeah.
So,
you mean, yes, if you use the 64-player mode of this game, it is less demanding. Yeah.
Yes.
That's right. So I think the second part that we need to address is it not utilizing more than 8 threads means that it's poorly optimized, which is not necessarily true.
Well, it's definitely not true at all.
The way that CPU limiting performance can come about in many different ways. There's many different things that can hit the CPU and limit you from getting higher frame rates. And the thing that people typically attribute to CPU performance is just rendering the normal aspects of the game. So this would be, loading in all the geometry and so forth, and you need the CPU to do that quicker than the GPU, otherwise you'll be CPU limited. So when you're playing a game like CS:GO, the reason why it can run at like 600 FPS is because the CPU rendering, this amount of time that needs to be spent actually rendering the game on the CPU side is so tiny that it can run on the GPU as well super quick. Whereas with Battlefield, that is a component. You're still going to get the CPU having to render just part of the game world. But another part is dealing with the 128-player multiplayer. And this aspect is less able to be sped up because like we talked about in this previous question, they're going to be updating the position of the enemies at the tick rate of the game. So the tick rate is usually, it might be 60 hertz or 120 hertz or whatever the game decides to go with.
Probably not that high, but go on.
But it's less than the frame rate that you're achieving.
Yeah.
So that portion of the CPU load is fixed. It's going to be activated every 60 seconds or every 60 hertz, so 60 times a second, fixed. So the fact that you have double the CPU resources isn't speeding up that portion of the game, because that portion is run on a timer essentially and is the same for every single person. So you can't increase the frame rate if you're you can't just say, oh, I'm going to use another 8 cores to do this certain
Task, yep.
thing. That's not necessarily the way that it works. It might complete that task more quickly, but it still might be CPU limited by other things. You never know. So that's one aspect where it's hard to just say, well, we could throw more cores at the problem and make the game run twice as fast. Again, it could be limited by single thread performance, which, again, people like to say that's poorly optimized, but it might be very tricky to do. It might be cache or memory limited.
Yeah,
How do you resolve that?
I hate even, because of this common core misconception, I hate to even talk about cores, because then people have got the impression from what you've just said that, oh, I need a fixed amount of cores to be able to play that game. So this here was, we know Battlefield 2042 can utilize 8 cores. It doesn't need 8 cores. So there is context switching, but it's not, if we had a quad core CPU that ran at 10 gigahertz, had massive IPC and slaughtered Alder Lake, then it would run this game just fine. So it's about, as you were saying, you have a fixed workload. You have a thing that needs to be processed.
Yep.
And it can be processed in up to 8 chunks or less. But as long as you process all of it in the time it needs to be processed, the game plays as desired.
Yep.
So if you go, well, let's do it in 16, in no way does that improve performance, because it's a fixed workload that can work within 8 cores of a Zen 2 part, for example.
Yep.
So if you go to Zen 3 and you add twice as many cores, the overall workload is the same. You're just breaking it up into smaller chunks. So you can do. So all it means is, rather than using, let's go Zen 3, rather than using 70% of 8 cores, you're now using 30 to 35% of 16.
Yeah, and I think the misconception often comes with, at least in my opinion, when you're talking about this issue, is people like to look at a workload like Cinebench, where, for example, you max out all the cores on 8 cores.
Just goes as fast as it can go.
It goes as fast as it goes. It might complete it in 3 minutes. Then you run it on a 16-core CPU. It runs it in half the time. It runs it in
It'd be like
30.
a canned benchmark that has a set amount of frames that need to be rendered.
Yeah.
And then, so if you do it at 60 FPS, it plays back at normal speed like a 60 FPS motion video. But if you can render them at 2000 FPS, the benchmark goes, boop, done.
Yeah.
But that's not how games work. And
exactly.
You're rendering as many as you can per the second, not in total.
The same with something like video playback. Like there's no advantage to you running video playback at 2000 FPS, as you say, because you won't be able to
speed watching,
because you won't see what's going on. You need to make sure that you've rendered each frame and then you wait and you do the next thing. So that is key into why a game like Battlefield 2042 is not necessarily able to be just 16 cores doesn't make it the savior of that problem.
So if 16 core processors, if the 5950X was an entry-level CPU by 2021 standards, and there was 16 cores, 24 cores, 32 cores, and 64 cores, and the 16 was the slowest, and the game only used 8 of the 16 cores, then that would be poorly optimized for the available hardware. But the problem we have here is we have people still with quad cores that are sort of getting pushed out, but we have plenty of people with 6-core CPUs and 8-core CPUs. And if you're using 70% of a Zen 3 16-core CPU, it will run on quite literally nothing else.
Yeah, that's the problem. You're sort of saying, okay, I'm going to take this 128-player processing chunk, and on my super fast 16-core CPU, that's going to be done in a fraction of a second, and then I'm sitting around doing nothing. So then you say, okay, well, now let's massively increase that so that my 16-core CPU is now, it's using a lot of that CPU. Then you take that chunk and you say, now we have to run it on a Ryzen 5 1600. And you put it on that CPU and it's like, we can't keep up with real-time processing of this workload anymore because you've optimized it for the wrong point. So the benefit that you get is from, yes, the CPU isn't fully utilized on a 5950X, but that idle time that the CPU is doing is allowing the more entry-level CPUs to actually run the game at all. Yeah, and I think to wrap this question up, it's important to then note, okay, so adding 16 cores to the problem isn't going to improve that fixed workload. So the question then becomes, well, why doesn't the game just, run at a higher FPS or whatever reason? And that's because as your data pretty clearly shows, I think when you look at it, is that the limiting factor shifts from core count to other aspects of the CPU like cache and
Basically,
memory
IPC,
latency.
yeah.
So the reason, and you see that very clearly with like 12th gen CPUs where they're all very similar, but you can see a little bit of a staggering between the parts as you get some cache differences and so on. So again, you could shift the workload so that 16 threads becomes the limiting factor, but you're just shifting it from one limitation to another limitation. And then the question becomes, okay, how do you fix cache and DRAM optimization limitations, which those things are not solved by adding an extra amount of threads. You can't, if the game is cache limited, then adding an extra 8 threads of processing doesn't prevent it from being cache limited. The cache will limit it and it will prevent the threads from being utilized. So again, it's a lot to talk about, and why this question has been going for so long is because games are very complicated. There's a lot of different things that can limit performance. Different games limit things in different ways. It's even apparent in, say, DDR5 versus DDR4 testing on Alder Lake, where some games are faster on DDR4, some games are faster on DDR5. It's just some games may benefit from, say, the latency benefits of DDR4. Some may benefit from the bandwidth of DDR5. And there's no one-fits-all sort of solution where you could say, okay, games that are cache limited are all poorly optimized, but games that are core limited are well optimized. You have to take them all on, I think, individual basis and sort of come to a conclusion of whether it's poorly optimized or not. And I think in the case of Battlefield 2042, the game is doing a lot. It's clear to me, at least, that adding more threads to the game is not going to fix the cache and DRAM latency implications, and they've developed it in a way that you still get 60 FPS at 1080p on fairly mid-range hardware, fairly acceptable hardware.
Yeah, like again, I'm sure if they put time and energy into it, they could make it a bit more optimized. Whether they could make it massively different, I doubt, but... Okay.
Yeah, and again, to keep this question going, because I find this topic very interesting, but there's a lot of single-player games that are just like Battlefield that you just cannot run higher than 100 FPS. Like,
yeah, there's a lot.
Try run Cyberpunk at 200 FPS. You cannot do it. You will be limited by various different things. There's a lot of those flagship top-end titles where they're doing a lot, just cannot be run at hundreds of FPS on modern hardware. It's just not possible.
Yeah, I think it's where you can really bash the developer if you want, or EA, is just for the amount of bugs that are in the game. So it's an expensive game to purchase. Yep. The performance, it's difficult to say how much optimization work still needs to be done, or how much, how possible it is to improve performance beyond what we're currently seeing. But the bugs, in my opinion, are completely inexcusable. Like, there's a lot of bugs. I've got a mate who plays a lot. He really enjoys the Battlefield series. And he's like, a new bug crops up every hour for him when he's playing. Like, something happens and ruins the entire experience. And the game's not cheap. It's not free to play. It's not early access. It's an expensive game. The amount of bugs we're seeing is laughable. Like,
exactly.
If you want to give them a hard time, go after them for that.
Yeah, it seems unpolished from just a general sense, as opposed to, the performance is probably the least of their concerns at the moment. I've seen the Steam reviews and stuff that are really bad, and it's just,
so we're not defending them.
It's just it's a very different game to CS:GO or Overwatch or Fortnite, where those are designed to run on a potato. Battlefield is designed for high performance.
But yeah, again, even like Fortnite, there's been so many performance-related issues they've added. So they added DirectX 12, which didn't really help, and it actually hurt stability more often than not. So they added a performance mode, which strips so much out of the game and makes it much more simple presentation, somewhere between like a PC and a mobile version of the game.
Yep.
And a lot of pro gamers use that now because lower input and all that sort of stuff. But basically, even that game that is made for potatoes and has been around for a very long time at this point still has performance-related problems with a lot of players.
Multiplayer's hard.
Yeah. All right, we're going to hit pause there on part 1. A lot of good questions there, but we have a lot more to go. There will be a part 2 and then a part 3. You guys probably know the drill by now each month. But yeah, it's good to be here in the new studio.
I'm loving it. It's been so long since I've done that drive, and
yes,
it was pretty good. Pretty good to get out and about for once.
Yep, good to come over my side of the state.
Yeah, that's right.
See the greener side of the state.
It is a bit greener.
Oh, cool. I didn't
A little bit.
Wasn't sure if you'd give that to me, but I'm going to take it.
It's green. Greener doesn't mean better.
No,
But it's greener.
I wasn't insinuating that at all. But anyway, no. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed having slightly different backdrop, less Lego in the background for this Q&A. First time in, I want to say over a year.
We can fix that though next time.
Yep.
I've got a few unbuilt things. We
Bring
can
some
come
Lego over and get some Lego on the backdrop. I have another set as well that we want to, hopefully
Nice.
early next year we can do the Q&A there. Anyway, enough of all that. Thank you guys for watching. We have Float Plane and Patreon if you'd like to watch the live stream each month. Tim and I just did that for this month, but there'll be another one coming up. What do we do? Behind the scenes content,
Yep.
Q&A stuff apparently.
Yep.
And we have an awesome Discord server. Really cool community over there. The Harbour Unboxed community on Discord. Tim and myself are always on there chatting with you guys. So yeah, if you're interested in that, as I said, links for those things are in the video description. Check them out. But if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this Q&A with Tim and myself. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your Tim.